the Global Coherence Pulse is really part of a larger citizen scientist project. We're really measuring the effects on the global fields from all of us being here together, and through the Global Consciousness Project, which we're also becoming the new home for. And so far, most, if not all, of the pulses are actually showing a significant effect on the global field environment. Yay, which is one of our suggestions there, is that it's not necessarily the amount of people to have measurable global effects, but how coherent we are, how when we come together in the heart, in a heart coherent state collectively, that we put out a bigger pulse. And that's really what this is all about. And as part of that larger work on really scientifically, I think, verifying what most of us intuitively already know, that is that we all are deeply interconnected with each other, with the earth, the trees, all natural systems. So we're really hoping to show that, and because for many, science is the new religion, and if science says, then we'll pay more attention to it, because it's really all about us being more responsible for being more self-responsible for the energies we're feeding the field. And so today, really looking forward to sharing the recent launch of a brand new project to add another element to that work, which is trees and measuring the electrical activity of trees. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we will get going. All right, so hopefully everybody can see the slide there. This is, again, a citizen scientist project to globally be able to measure the electrical activity of trees. So we're actually measuring the electrical potential, and there's little devices we put on the trees, put a couple of electrodes you can see over here in this picture. And all right, let me click here. Just a little background. The first person that I know of to measure the electrical activity of trees in the 1960s was Saxton Burr, who was a professor at Yale University. And his work with trees and other measuring people and stuff, he termed what he called L fields, life fields basically, and suggested that there really are fields in all living systems that are very similar to the other known fields in physics, electromagnetism and so on, and although more complex, that they obey similar laws. And so this is some of his data from one of his books, recorded in the 1960s on a maple tree and an elm tree for over long time periods. And around that same time, 1973, the book some of you probably are familiar with, The Secret Life of Plants, which was based on the work of Cleve Baxter. And Cleve, he's passed away a number of years ago now, but he was actually a close friend and spent a lot of time here at HeartMath. And he actually taught me a lot, and us here at the lab, we replicated many of his experiments ourselves, kind of convinced ourselves. But when the Secret Life of Plants came out, because Cleve was basically suggesting that plants respond to human emotions, and they bond with the person that cares for them, and they prefer certain types of music over others, and so on. And so we actually, like I said, did verify this, but he got a lot of heat. And some other, this just was so against the paradigm of, especially at that era, that kind of got written off by the scientific community. And some other experiments supposedly that proved that he was wrong, that if you look at them, were really horrible experiments that were doomed to fail. And it's wonderful to see that I think we can confidently say that Cleve was really right all along. And because in the last several decades, there's a new generation of plant scientists that have emerged that are really showing that plants are endowed with what we could think of as feelings. And they have complex social interactions. They communicate with each other, certainly, and also with plants. Just kind of quickly go through a couple examples here. This is by no means an exhaustive kind of presentation on this, but one of the I think really neat studies is showing that in this case Mimosa plants can actually learn. And this was a really clever set of experiments that was done by a biologist, Monica Galliano, where she figured out a way to safely drop the plants so that they wouldn't hurt. And one of the things mimosas do is when they detect danger or things, is they close their leaves. And the Mimosa plants would learn that in that experiment that they weren't really harmed, so they would learn that they would stop doing that. And they actually held that memory for up to a month, which is a very long-term memory. And these were very clever experiments and very well controlled, so I won't go into all the detail, but it was one of the first demonstrations of actual that kind of a memory in plants. And so there's a new trend in the plant work, plant research world, plant and trees, called plant neurobiology, as they like to call themselves. And it's really focused on understanding how plants and trees process information at the whole organism level. And some of the mechanisms by how they do this and how they signal this. And I've actually seen some of this myself. I've been here in the redwood forest, I think twice over the last few years, where I just happened to be out in the woods in nature. And I've seen a tree release its pollen in a coordinated way. It's like this giant explosion of cloud that happens all at once. It's really amazing to see how they do that, and how in the heck do trees all across all of the leaves and all of the entire tree know how to do that. It's really quite fascinating to actually see that happen. It's clear now that the trees have the same senses we do, or the kind of what you could think of as the equivalent of those senses. But they have a lot more sensory systems of the environment than we do, around 20 different sensory systems that have been validated to have. And relative to what we're talking about here in terms of measuring the electrical activity of trees, they have sensors that detect, well, obviously humidity, but things like gravity, vibrations, and electromagnetic fields, which is quite relevant, as we'll see. So in this new generation of plant biologists, they're really suggesting that intelligence is the ability to solve problems, and that it doesn't have to be neurons in a brain. This is one of the old guard kind of arguments, is that you can't have intelligence without neurons. And this has been kind of a source of contention between the old guard and the new guard in the plant and tree research world. But the newer generation is suggesting that we have to think of intelligence differently, that it doesn't have to be just around neurons, that it can be distributed across the entire plant or tree in how they gather information. And there's actually kind of similar things happening in human research now, that we have to think of as intelligence, not just as the brain and neurons, but the synchronized activity and the harmonious activity of the brain and the body together. In fact, I had a fascinating call earlier this morning with a researcher who's really advancing that way of thinking. Just another kind of example here by Suzanne Simard, who was, I think, the first to show that using kind of isotopes that she would put into like the mother tree, for example, and has found that the trees are communicating underground through the mycelium networks and so on with each other, but that mother trees recognize their kin. They know who their babies are, so to speak, and they share nutrients with them. They change their behaviors to help protect them. And even more fascinating, what this work has shown is that even across species, trees cooperate. They share resources based on the seasons and the time of years, and share glucose and different resources. And I really think that we have a lot to learn from nature here, because this is true cooperation at a community, you could think of as a global kind of consciousness, which is why I believe that nature and trees and the plant world thrive. And if I had to say one quality about nature, at least in the plant world, is thriving. They thrive. You know, I live here, as Teresa does, in Santa Cruz County, where some of you might know we had a very big fire 2 years ago. This is called the CZU fire, that really wiped out one of the large old growth redwood forests here. A huge, one of the top 10 the most destructive fires in the history of California. And just a year later, 2 years now, it's amazing to see how the forest has recovered and the regeneration that's rapidly happening. So the good living example of how nature really does thrive because they've learned to cooperate, from my perspective, and share resources. Which is another element about the plant and tree world, is they're really energy efficient. They're really intelligent about how they utilize their energy resources. So this is kind of a quote from a book called Brilliant Green, that basically is research showing that every choice a plant makes is based on the smallest, quantity of resources that solves the problem, the larger problem. So we're starting to see many ways of the intelligence of nature, at least in the plant and tree world. Now this is, for this project we're doing here, this is an example of two trees here on our property in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This is a redwood tree and an oak tree that we've been monitoring for some time, and we put little electrodes in the tree to measure the electrical activity. And as you can see, trees have circadian rhythms and pretty dynamic electrical lives. And it's surprisingly little research has been done on the electrical signaling, electrical activity of trees. There's a huge explosion on the biochemistry and the underground networks and so on. But really looking at the electrical is very few studies. So there's a lot of unknown here. Now, one of the things that you'll see here on looking at this is the scale of which these voltages are measured. These are in what's called millivolts. And when we measure humans, for example, when we measure the electrocardiogram from the heartbeat of a person, it's also measured in millivolts. And we compare that to brain waves or the EEG, that's in microvolts. So it's an order of magnitude larger. So trees are producing quite large, surprisingly large electrical voltages. And this is a bit of a mystery for how they actually do this. We do have some thoughts on the mechanisms of that, but that for another day. But anyway, just kind of wanted you to see the dynamics of what these tree potentials look like there. So what we're doing with the Global Tree Potential Monitoring Network, this is very much citizen science based. So those of you that have a favorite tree, it's on your property or in your backyard or whatever, you can get one of these devices to hook up your own tree. And it's called the RTU for Remote Tree Unit. It goes on the tree. And then that sends via radio link the electrical information from the tree back to a base station in your home, which is connected to your local Wi-Fi. And then that sends the data back to a central server and website where you can actually go see your tree's data, electrical activity, and all the other trees that are part of that network. So that's the basics of how how it works. So some of our key research questions, just I'll summarize very quickly here. Are trees affected by human emotions? And to do that, we've learned a lot over the years, especially from the Global Consciousness Project, that to really do that and have any kind of convincing data from a scientific perspective, you've got to look at a lot of trees simultaneously. And you have to look over many, many events of things that either trigger a large emotional outpouring of humanity or organized events like we're doing here today, where we really come together with a focus to interact with the trees on an energetic level. And do that enough times that we can start looking across the global network to see, are the trees responding in a similar way at a global level? Can trees help predict earthquakes? That might be surprising to hear that one. So with each tree unit, there's two different channels, as we call them. One that's measuring the electrical activity of the tree, but then we also put a stake into the ground to measure the between the tree and the ground, which is measuring basically the currents within the earth. And one of our colleagues and collaborators, I think of him as the grandfather of pre-earthquake signal research, has developed a very elegant model. It's a new model that shows how when rocks are under pressure, like around earthquake faults, they literally turn into batteries with sustained currents that can flow through the earth and up to the surface of the earth. And this is supported by actual research measuring tree potentials in Japan, showing that these earth potentials measured by trees and their root system networks into the ground before larger earthquakes will shift about 2 weeks prior to a larger earthquake. So this is another kind of exciting thing that they could benefit from this project as well. And then over time, if we get enough of these trees around the earth, we'll ask some questions. I think we might be able to ask, are trees communicating with each other over large distances? Do they have their own kind of communication system at the energetic level? Intuitively, I believe they do, but we don't know. We'll have to see. Can we measure this? And I think we might also be able to get more insights into how the biofields of trees have an uplifting effect on people. Many studies show they do, of course. Especially again in Japan, they have a thing called nature bathing where they go out into the forest. And some studies have actually shown that when interacting with nature, there is something unique about forests and trees that's different than just being by oceans or deserts and things like this. That has a unique uplifting effect on humans. So if you're interested in becoming a citizen scientist and have a favorite tree that you would like to hook up, you can go to treerhythms.net. It's a website there, and there's a form you can fill out to. Then we'll talk to you, call you, and see, make sure that your tree qualifies and so on. We're only going to do 100 trees to begin with, and we are just opening this up globally. We've had about 14, 15 trees here in the United States to work out any bugs, because anything new like this, there's always things you don't know that you discover, and we did. And we think we've got most of those things solved enough now that we're ready to go ahead and release these internationally. And so we've just sent out in the last couple of weeks our first international devices. There's a cost. It's about $600, or it is $600 to get involved, and that's far less than it costs us to actually make these things. This project really is supported by purely and totally by donations and donors around the world that really want to support this kind of work and looking at the interconnectivity with trees as well as our other projects. So that is the main thing I wanted to share with you today on what the project is about with the trees.
This is the human heart. Central to our physical body, our survival, revered by poets throughout history as the emotional center of our being. The place we instinctively touch when asked to point to ourselves.